Hi, everyone. On behalf of VMUG, I'd like to welcome you to today's Vali Cyber webcast, Sniff Out the Rat in Hypervisor Attacks, presented by Vali Cyber Threat Intelligence Lead, Nathan. Before we begin, I have a few quick housekeeping items to go over. First, today's webcast will be recorded and available for you on demand. You will receive an email with the on-demand link, so keep an eye out for that. Second, a Q&A session will follow today's presentation. All questions will need to be entered in the question and answer section on the bottom of your screen and answered after the presentation. And lastly, there will be a short online evaluation that pops up as you exit this webcast. Please take a minute and let us know what you thought of today's session. All right, let's get started. Nathan, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We've got some slides. Thanks so much for having me today. Let's see if I can share this so everybody can see. Okay. So hi, my name is Nathan Montier. I lead threat intelligence here at Vali Cyber. And today, as many of you probably know, what we're going to be talking about is RATs, so remote access Trojans specifically, and how they pertain to hypervisor attacks. A little bit about me. Like I said, I lead the threat intelligence team here at Vali Cyber. Before this, I was involved in offensive cyber operations for about 5 years, working with the US government. But I saw a really unique opportunity to help fill a gap that exists in the security environment that is hypervisor runtime security, and making sure that these really important backbone infrastructure type systems are more secure than they currently are. And to kind of talk about that a little bit, let's make sure that we understand what the issue is with hypervisors and why this is a little bit of a problem. So like this slide kind of shows, I won't go through each one of these details, but hypervisors need a security solution. In the last few years, attacks have been way up on hypervisors by a really large magnitude. And some examples of these include high-profile attacks like Johnson Controls or MGM, or even the MITRE breach that happened in 2024. That's actually one that I like to highlight sometimes, because the MITRE breach really highlights that even a very security conscious organization like the MITRE organization, who maintains things like the attack framework and really a lot of cataloging of common techniques, tactics, and procedures for offensive groups, even an organization like that really has a deep understanding of security, sometimes falls prey to this kind of thing. And it really brings to mind that old adage when it comes to security and cybersecurity, for sure, specifically, which is that it's not really a question of if, but when things are going to go wrong. And traditionally, hypervisors have not had any kind of security solution. We won't talk too much about the way that Vali Cyber changes that until probably the very end of the presentation. But what I really want to focus on is some of the techniques and the tactics that attackers will use, and specifically RATs today. We can also talk a little bit about how breaches typically start. For those of you who maintain a hypervisor, which is in this group probably quite a few, you may or may not be aware that some of the most common methods for the initial breach of a hypervisor environment are credential compromises, misconfigurations, and vulnerabilities. Now, in my demonstration today, we're going to talk very specifically about a vulnerability that exists in the ESXi hypervisor environment. But there's a lot of them. These are one of kind of the most, people talk about vulnerabilities in remote code execution, and that's oftentimes, I think, considered kind of the more mythical approach to gaining initial access in a system. And it is really cool, because we can basically just, run some very custom code, and there's almost nothing that the victim can do to prevent it as long as that vulnerability exists in their system. But oftentimes, and actually the lion's share of breaches really happen through more benign and mundane ways, like credential compromise and misconfiguration. This is why we talk about things like having secure passwords, and why multi-factor authentication is such a big thing. Just like it is on most endpoints, like say your Windows endpoints, that kind of attack, so just getting the passwords to legitimate accounts, is oftentimes how we see that these attacks happen in ESXi environments as well. Sometimes this can be through gaining a foothold in the environment, or gaining access to the domain controller. If you saw our last webinar in December, then you'll be aware that there are some very specific things that can happen from hypervisors after domain controllers are compromised. There's lots of different ways that this can happen, but these really are the major ways that we see breaches happen on hypervisor environments. But what we're here today to talk about is remote access Trojans specifically, and how they pertain to hypervisors. So for those who are not familiar, remote access Trojans, or RATs, I've given a definition here on the slide. It's a type of malware that's used to gain remote access to a system. And usually, hence the name part of the Trojan part of the name. Usually these are disguised as something else. So whether that be freeware that you download off of a sketchy website, or something in a phishing email that you thought was a legitimate script or utility. Oftentimes these are disguised as something that requires a little bit of user interaction to get the remote access Trojan running. And usually the reason that an attacker wants to use one is to ensure more persistent long-term access. So as you will see in the demonstration here in a few minutes, the exploit that I'm going to use to gain initial access to the hypervisor environment we're attacking today, the exploit that I have is a little bit temperamental, and it's not the most, it's a little bit ephemeral, and it can be killed pretty easy, and it's not really the best environment. In fact, when I was doing some testing in this environment just a couple hours ago, there are some hiccups that might even show themselves here in the demo. Don't worry, I have some workarounds for them if they do, but from the attacker's perspective, oftentimes the vulnerabilities that we use or the accounts that maybe we have access to, they work sometimes. And so a remote access Trojan is just one method that an attacker can use to ensure that they have that more persistent long-term access. That's usually the reason that you're going to see these deployed in a given environment. A lot of them do come through social engineering compromises. That's not what we're going to demonstrate today, obviously, because we're going to be using an exploit. So we won't be, sending an email or making a call using an AI voice changer or anything like that. Although those would be valid initial access vectors for placing a remote access Trojan on a victim machine. A lot of them do come through those social engineering attacks. And the basic functions is the most basic function is essentially a reverse shell. So as to give someone command line level access to whatever the victim machine is, and in this case, a hypervisor. But there have been rats that have been shown to have other functionality built in for attackers as well. Things like creating proxies or other network operations so that say the attacker can use it as a method of redirecting traffic from their machine to another victim machine, and even sensitive information theft depending on what kind of machine the remote access Trojan is installed on. Some famous rats. This one's really simple. Pikesy is one of them. Blackbite, PlugX, Ghost Rat, Dark Comet. These may be ones you've heard of. They may not be. Feel free to Google any of these. There's a lot more. These are just a couple examples that I was able to find with some quick searching and some also that I've had experience with in the past. But yeah, there's a lot of them. If you don't believe me, really, I urge you to go and do a quick internet search to try and find a couple of the rats that are being seen used in the wild today. So now let's talk just a little bit about what I'm going to be doing today. This is a basic map of what I'm going to do against this hypervisor environment using the rat that I've created here. So I'm going to play like I'm the attacker group. And this part is going to be kind of simulated. We're going to go out. We're not actually going to go onto Showdown and try and find one because this is obviously a hypervisor that I am hosting locally. So it's not really going to appear on Showdown. This is on a local network anyways. But I'm going to show you what that might look like in a real world environment if that were what was being done. And once I've discovered it, I'm going to conduct just a basic port scan to try and figure out what kind of services are open and if maybe there is an exploit that I can leverage that I already have access to against the ESXi environment that I found. And then I'm going to find the SLP services open on a vulnerable version of ESXi. And we'll talk a little bit about that as I do it. But basically, I'm going to find that, hey, there's a port that is available that is running a service that I know is vulnerable to the exploit that I have. I'm going to go ahead and launch that. I'm going to then establish my persistence because I don't want to continue using that somewhat temperamental exploit for forever. I'm going to establish my persistence using a rat. And then I'm going to initiate a reverse shell connection. So I'm going to make another connection that's a little bit more stable using the rat that I installed after the exploit. Now, what I'm also going to show with this part that doesn't really show up here is where I'm going to take you guys on a little bit of a tour of how we've established persistence and what this kind of thing might look like in general. After I gained access here in step 5 with that reverse shell connection from the rat, then I'm going to go ahead and try and steal a little bit of information. This will be pretty basic. You could spend a lot of time on this particular portion of demonstrating an attack, depending on what exactly the attacker is after. If they're after a very specific subset of sensitive information that's on this host, that might be something they are going after. In this case, we're just going to try and get user credentials and a little bit of network information about what's on the ESXi host so that we can get to the fun stuff afterwards. So we'll steal a little bit of information, and then we're going to do the next kind of really cool part of what I think is part of this demonstration, which is a living off the land ransomware attack against the hypervisor environment. Now, something I want to make sure to note here before we get too far into it is that part of from the attacker's perspective, part of the advantage that I have putting a rat on an ESXi host, or really any hypervisor, is that I have access to all of the virtual machines that are running on top of that hypervisor. Usually the point of a ransomware attack or a wiperware attack or a denial of service attack is to create an effect for the victim, right? We want to put some kind of pause on business. We want to cause them pain. In the case of ransomware, it's because we want to extort money from them. We want to say, hey, you can't use any of these virtual machines until you pay up. So by targeting a hypervisor, we automatically gain access to a much larger number of systems that they are using for business purposes by just attacking one machine. So I just want to draw attention to that and talk about why this is something that's a little bit more relevant for hypervisors, and why this is what we're seeing attackers do now, is we're seeing attackers more and more often do things like ransomware attacks or place remote access Trojans on Linux and hypervisor machines, because they're really relevant targets for them, and it's a way for them to have a much higher chance of getting the payments that they want out of this, making their money. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and press on to the next part. We're going to talk a little bit about that initial part. Now, I told you with the Shodan, this is an example of what a Shodan search might look like. Some parts of it have been redacted just to help protect the privacy, even though this is already essentially public information. But this is an example of what that might look like, and the kinds of things that we can see just through pulling a little bit of information from a publicly accessible website. For those who are less initiated with this, Shodan is a service that is constantly scanning large chunks of the internet. And it's trying just to do essentially basic enumeration and kind of port listing and that sort of thing. So they're going through and they're looking at just giant subnets of IPs and trying to figure out what's running on them. And the information that gets reported back, depending on the kinds of responses they get from their scans, can oftentimes be things like the versions of certain types of software that are running, which for an attacker who has a particular arsenal of exploits at their disposal, this is exactly the information they need to know where and who is vulnerable to the types of weapons that they have, the types of cyber attacks that they can launch. So in this particular instance, and I apologize if the text is a little too small, but you can see that, hey, we see that at this IP, we have, so this particular, we know where they are, and we know that it's publicly accessible because Shodan can see it. There's an ESXi 5.5.0 that's running. Down here, maybe there's an ESXi 6.0.0. There's going to be a bunch of different versions. This is just a very small subset of what we might see in that attack. Now, I'm going to go off of slides now. I'm going to jump into my virtual environment that we're going to be working in today. And we're going to start our attack now that we have a little bit of information. Now, to save us time, I went ahead and I ran, just before we jumped into the webinar here today, I went ahead and ran 2 Nmap scans of this particular environment. The thing that we're going to simulate in my demo here today is that we have a system at the 192.168.175.169 address, which is obviously on my local subnet. It's something that I'm hosting here locally. It's an ESXi machine, but we're going to say that's what we found on Shodan. This is the machine that we found out there in the wild. And just from a really, really quick basic Nmap scan that took 2.6 seconds, we see a list of some of the open services that are here. Now, this will not come as a surprise to most of you. This is a really basic Nmap scan, just to take a look at some services. Now, the one that's interesting to me is 427, because I know that I have an exploit against the SLP service on ESXi, and that service typically runs on port 427. So if I know this is an ESXi machine, and it also has that port open, then we're already in good shape. The second scan that I ran, and this is the reason why I didn't do this part live, is because this one took a little over 2 minutes. This one took 140 seconds to run. Is I scanned the web server. I scanned the service that was running on port 443. The reason I did this is because this is one of the more reliable ways with an ESXi machine to get relevant version information back about maybe what version of ESXi we're running, so that I can know if my exploit is going to be effective against this. And the information that I found here is that we are running ESXi, VMware ESXi 6.7.0. Now, this is good news for me as an attacker, because this is going to enable that next step in this particular attack chain. It means my exploit is going to work. Now, I mentioned that this one is a little bit temperamental, but the next thing we're going to do is we're going to transition to that stage. Now that I have this information, I'm going to go ahead and run my exploit. So I'm running this against that same host that's running on the 175.169 address. And basically what we're doing is we're sending a bunch of queries to that service, And then there is a particular vulnerability where there's a spot in service memory where if we just make the exact right network request to that service, we can actually overwrite some of the code that is going to be executed. So this is a full remote code execution vulnerability. And now I'm going to prove that out by showing you this. So if we just run a quick uname a command, we can see, hey, this is the information. There's that VMware 6.7.0 version that we expect to see. It's identifying itself as ESXi just from a quick uname a. So I have access. I could just use this access to do whatever nasty things it was that I wanted to do. But I know that this exploit, as I mentioned before, sometimes fails on me. Sometimes the connection goes down. And I have an interest in remaining on this host for a long period of time. So instead of doing everything through this particular connection and relying on this exploit, I'm going to place a rat now. And actually, something else I should mention is that this exploit is a one-time use exploit. So ESXi hosts typically are not restarted very, very frequently because that leads to downtime. People don't want to have to restart their ESXi hosts. Happens occasionally, but not frequently. And unless someone goes in and they restart the SLP service, I've actually killed it by running this exploit. So if I lose my connection now, I would have to restart that ESXi host to be able to run the exploit again. So I have a real big interest here in being able to run a rat on this machine so that I can reliably come back in and establish a little bit more persistence. Now, the way that I'm going to do this, and bear with me while I get my pastable commands here that I've prepared, is I'm going to move a file over, and this is going to be a Python file. Something that I want to highlight about this particular attack is, as with any cyber attack, as with any kind of like network attack that we run against a machine, at least for demonstrative and educational purposes, we could do a lot of different things. I'm going to go ahead and run the other half of this over here too, and let's actually see if that worked. So this is where we get in this timed out command down here. This is where things do get a little bit temperamental. And if we can't make this work as a backup, I'm going to wave my magic hand and say that we were able to gain some SSH credentials from this initial exploit just so we can progress with the demonstration. But usually this exploit, although it is a little bit finicky, it will work eventually. So I'll kind of talk through some of this while we're discussing it. Okay, this is actually a good sign because what we're seeing here is we're seeing that those commands that I just typed in are actually getting piped back over the netcat connection. So from this exploit, I was able to, let me go ahead and kill that so that we can get this. I was able to, and let's go ahead and take a look here now and see if sc.h.py made it on. It did. Okay, great. I was able to move that file over post exploit. So essentially what I did is I opened up a netcat listener on one end and I made a connection to that netcat listener from the other end, and I moved a little Python script that we're going to use as the first stage for our rat via that netcat connection. Okay, so the next step is going to be executing that Python script. And we are going to do that again from our exploit terminal here. So we're going to go ahead and, well, actually, first, let me show you guys kind of what it looks like. Let's see if we can, yeah, let's see if this, hopefully this doesn't break anything. If it does, again, we have a couple workarounds, but I think this will be instructive just to show. Yeah, I don't think we're gonna be able to get the whole thing just the way that this terminal works. Again, this is highlighting that when we run these exploits that are kind of magic, right? These are kind of magic, that the fact that I was able to get access to this machine is kind of amazing without any kind of credential or authorization, but they don't always work perfectly. So we need to leverage it into something else. But what you can see is that this sc_h.py is my simple calculator for hypervisors. That's what this is. And because this is a Trojan, and this could be anything, right? This is what I was trying to get at earlier here, is that when we talk about these attacks, although I'm using a very silly Python script here that's supposed to be run as a simple calculator, and you may be thinking, well, hey, that's not a Python script that I would ever run in your environment. Okay, that's fair, but something probably is. And whatever that Python script could be, you could do a one-for-one swap of my simple calculator here, and it could still be a dropper for a remote access Trojan. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and run, if I can type, I'm going to try and run our sc_h .py script, and oh wait, oops. Okay. Oh, see, well, we're getting some of the rest of the output of that cat command. Okay, great. So it does look like this is errored out a little bit. Yeah, there we go. We're going to say 1. Okay, great. So we made the choice to add. Again, because of the weirdness of this terminal from the exploit, because I tried to look at a large file. We're again just highlighting these exploits are a little bit temperamental and they don't result in the most stable connection. But now we've made it a choice to add, and we're just going to add 2. Okay, no, we're actually going to be multiplying because that was 2 and it took that command this time. So we're going to multiply 2 times 2, and it says, hey, Okay, so actually it is erroring a little bit. It did take the 1 as the add. So we got 2 + 2 = 4. The simple calculator did its thing, and we're going to say no, hey, we don't want to run another calculation. So that was our Trojan, right? This was the software that pretended to be just a simple calculator, but in reality actually dropped something in the background that is going to act like a remote access Trojan. Now, for the eagle-eyed out there, you may notice what the difference is already. There are a lot more stealthy ways that we could do this, but for purposes of the demo, I wanted to make sure that there was something that was visible that changed after we ran that Python script so that you can kind of see maybe how a remote access Trojan would work in the wild. Now, this is the file in particular that got dropped. And there's actually a few others, a couple other things that happened in the background too, including an addition to our cron tabs. But what we're going to do is, I don't want to try and view that file again because of the nature of this exploit, but I'm going to go ahead and exit out of our exploit. And we're just going to play like we're the administrator now really quick. So we're going to log back in just with an SSH session. So this isn't part of the exploit. This is just so that we can do a little bit of information gathering to make sure that everything is working. Oops. And we'll look for this. Now, the way that this is going to work is what I have done, and we're now on the ESXi system through an SSH connection. I'm actually going to take a look at the cron tabs really quick, because I want everyone to be able to see one of the changes that was made. So one of the changes that was made here was that we added to the cron tabs, which again, just as a quick explanation, this is one of the utilities that we use sometimes on ESXi, a lot of times on Linux systems, to run regularly scheduled background services and scripts and that kind of thing. So what we'll see here is that this libnetley.lib.sh script now has been scheduled to run once every minute. And if you also recall, that libnetley.lib.sh script is a script that I placed here after running that Python rat dropper that we ran just a moment ago. If we take a look at this, we won't go through every line of this, obviously, because we don't have the time to do that today. But essentially what it's going to do is it's going to open a listener on port 1000, and it's going to wait for a specific set of commands that I, as the attacker, am ready over on the other end, on my remote end, to send a command to connect to, so that it sends back a connection to me and gives me a much more stable shell so I can go in and do whatever I want on this hypervisor. So just by running that Python script, I was able to drop another script, and I was also able to make additions to the scheduled jobs in the background, which gives me persistence. Now, the way that we're going to verify that we actually got that persistence running is, I'm actually going to wait for this. So we actually don't see the netcat listener up yet. Watch us. Let's just take a look here. So we know that every minute it should be attempting to run that listener. And if we watch the internal system clock here, we can see that we're about 15 seconds from that happening. Now, what's interesting is it'll only do this once. So if it notices that there's a listener already running, this is part of that libnetley bash script that we have running. That's the real remote access Trojan here. So if it notices that there's already a netcat service that's running, it's actually not going to spawn it. Okay, and what we're actually going to do is we're going to manually run it just once. Okay, great. Yeah, and then we're going to come over here, and we're going to say, so what we're doing now is we said, hey, we're going to manually run once that particular little listener, but now we're going to run our connector script. And just to prove out that the connection comes through, we're going to run a uname a command. There is a quick sleep function in there. And now it looks like, hey, we got that same information. It looks like we're connected, that 6.7 version ESXi host that we dropped with that Python script. So we have reliably now been able to connect to a system that we no longer need an exploit for, just using the remote access Trojan that we had dropped there previously. So we can do whatever we want at this point. We can figure out what kind of files are in place there. We can do things like, I mentioned that we would try and just get some basic user credentials, so you can probably guess exactly what command I'm going to run. I'm just going to try and cat etc shadow. And if you look at that, hey, look, we can see the hash for root. Now in the background, what we might do is, this would take a little bit of time. We're not going to do this today in this demo, but we might try and crack this password by extracting this hash from etc shadow. Some other things we might do is we might look at, say, what are the virtual machines that are on this ESXi host. So I'm going to grab just a quick command to do that. which we're just going to list, what is in the data store machines, right? And we got Frodo, Gandalf, and Gimli. If you've seen any of our webinars before, you know that we like to use these as some of the names for our virtual machines. And then another thing we might do really quick now that we have this access via the remote access Trojan is maybe we just want to look at like network connections. So let's take a look. Now we can see, maybe other hosts that are connected to this ESXi box. We can see the different ports that services are running on. All of this could be useful information depending on what our ultimate goal is. And all I want to do here is just do a quick a highlight of some of the information that now could be extracted. Obviously, with a root level shell on a hypervisor, there's pretty much the sky is the limit in terms of that machine at the very least. We could be shutting down virtual machines, we could be starting them up, we could be putting a new one in, or we could be launching a ransomware attack, which in just a moment is what we're going to be doing. Now, we know that the virtual machines that we were looking at, we had Frodo, Gandalf, and Gimli. To make this a little bit more digestible, what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch a living off the land ransomware attack just against Gandalf. And I want to make sure that I've got this copied in a way that will allow us to take a look at what's happening. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to send this command through here in just a second. A living off the land ransomware attack basically just means that I'm not going to be bringing in any kind of new binaries. I'm not going to be using any of the actual real world ransomware binaries that we've found in the wild that have been used in real campaigns, because maybe I'm worried about detection. I don't want someone to see a new executable on this ESXi host, at least more than what I've already put there to make sure that the rat works, right? So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use all command line functions to do what equates to a ransomware attack. And I'll go ahead and prove out that this works here in just a second. But you can see this is just a simple grep command looking at what is in machines/Gandalf, what's in that directory, right? Which is going to be like the VMDK files and other files associated with that virtual machine. Then I'm going to pipe that into OpenSSL. I'm going to use AES 256-bit encryption with a goofy, bad ransomware password over here. And then at the very end, I'm going to append a nuclear radiation symbol just to spook the end user, right? When they go through and they see that, hey, all the Gandalf files have this nuclear radiation symbol on the end of them, what's going on? This is pretty indicative that, hey, you have had an intrusion in your environment. Someone has been able to go in and mess with your files. This is a bad day. So mostly this is to scare the victim into, say, making a ransom payment. So I'm going to go ahead and let that run. This usually only takes just a second. We won't get a new prompt here because our shell doesn't give a prompt to say that the command is run. But we'll run just a quick ls to see. Okay, so it looks like it's already gone ahead and completed. Now, the next thing I'm going to do to try and show that we actually did encrypt some files, or at the very least make significant modifications to them, we're going to just run a quick ls in that Gandalf directory that we attempted to exploit, or that we attempted to do that encryption on. And as you can see, so we have the Gandalf flat VMDK file up there, but we've also got Gandalf, the normal, just the VMDK file, the vanilla one down here. We've got the NVRAM file. All of these have been, at the very least, modified, and as we know, they've been encrypted. But from the end user perspective, we can look at this and just say, hey, something is definitely going very, very wrong here, right? So we've been able to launch a living off the land ransomware attack by just essentially putting in one line of script. Super easy to do just from a very, very rudimentary, reverse shell connection like what we have here. So now to kind of prove out that that is in fact what happened, because we have network access, and again, we know that I'm just going to log in like I'm the actual legitimate administrator. If I can type and talk at the same time. The actual legitimate administrator on this particular host. So again, you can see we're here on the 175.169 host. And here's our Gandalf virtual machine. So it's turned off right now. Let's see what happens if we try and power this guy on. Failed to power on the virtual machine. Gandalf VMDK was not found. So already this is turning into a really bad day for me, all because I had a rat in my hypervisor environment. So I hope that by kind of running through some of the some technical kind of tactics, techniques, and procedures for how a remote access Trojan like this might work, this kind of helps you to see what the dangers are for remote access Trojans in hypervisor environments. Now, I'm happy to kind of talk a little bit more about how this one works, why we did things the way that we did them, and maybe what other remote access Trojans would look like. But yeah, I hope that this has been somewhat instructive. I'm going to switch back over to a couple slides just to round things out really quick. Let's start from this slide. Bear with me here for just a sec. Okay, so we were able to see kind of this basic remote access Trojan attack happen against the hypervisor. So let's talk about how we keep our hypervisors secure then. There's a lot of no nonsense, kind of no brainer answers to that question. That some of them you can see here on the slide, like updating and patching all of your software systems and services. Now, I know that is sometimes easier said than done. Working on a patch schedule that works for you, and also assuming that the service providers that you're working with, in this case, say VMware or just the ESXi team, are providing patches in a timely manner that can avoid attacks, right? Providing patches before maybe the exploit becomes a public resource that a lot of attackers are using. There's a lot of assumptions there, so it's not an absolute no-fail strategy. It really is that it's not if but when kind of thing that gets highlighted by some of these. Disabling unused ports and services like 427 for SLP is another really good example of things we can do. Now, in more modern versions of ESXi, SLPD by default actually is disabled. And that's, to my understanding, that's largely because of exploits like this. There was actually, I think, a few of them that were essentially remote code execution against the SLP service, which I think prompted the switch to having that disabled by default on ESXi host. Strict password policies is another good one. I mean, you saw me extract the hash for the root user there on the ESXi host. It would still take me time to be able to crack that password, but hey, given enough time, you can do it. And also, if it's not a very secure password, then that time is going to be a lot shorter than it would be otherwise. So obviously, this is kind of, again, a no-brainer one, but it's effective against attacks like this, and this is part of the reason why those are the recommendations. Multi-factor authentication is a tough one. Especially on hypervisor systems, because there often isn't a lot of that capability baked in. We can talk a little bit more about that with ZeroLock and Vali Cyber, and kind of how we play with multi-factor authentication and bring that capability to hypervisors. But traditionally, that's not really been something that's been available in environments like that, though it would help prevent attacks like this. Now, in this case, I did use an exploit, and I only used SSH just to do information gathering in the background. So maybe it wouldn't have helped against this attack, but against all of those credential theft attacks, like we talked about at the beginning, which really is a huge share of initial access exploits against hypervisor systems, multi-factor authentication is a great way to help prevent those, or at least to mitigate them. Regular audits of IDS, IPS seams, firewalls, and network logs is obviously another really good way to help verify things. In this particular attack, if you saw all of those netcat connections that were being made, or all the strange port 1000 stuff that was happening, those could be good indicators of a compromise. Now, if I were devoting a lot of time and energy to trying to make sure that I was less visible, or that I was a little bit more obfuscated, there's a lot of things that I as an attacker could have done differently. I could have encrypted my network traffic. That could have been one thing, because over that netcat connection, I'm mostly going to be sending things over plain text. I could have moved that libnetley script that acted as the rat. I could have moved it to another spot that wasn't just the home directory on the ESXi host. There's a lot of things that I could have done differently to help hide from say a defense team that was examining and protecting that ESXi host. But regular audits of all of these resources are a good way to help mitigate and make it much, much more difficult for attackers to be able to do things like what I did today. And then implementing a runtime solution like an EDR. Now, again, just like the multi-factor authentication, that one has been a struggle in hypervisor environments for a long time. But kind of the final couple slides here, I'm going to talk a little bit about Vali Cyber and how we help fill that particular gap when it comes to things like EDR and multi-factor authentication in hypervisor environments. So our product is called ZeroLock. It is defense in depth for ESXi and Nutanix and Proxmox and other hypervisor environments, as well as Linux. But obviously, here in a VMUG group, we're going to talk a lot more about the ESXi solution. It's multi-layered, and really what that means is that there's several different protections on top of each other. I talked a little bit about multi-factor authentication before, and the way that we really implement this is using time-based tokens for SSH multi-factor authentication. So if you're using SSH to do administration on ESXi hosts, as some people are, then this is a great way to help ensure that those connections are going to be secure and that you really have the person that you think you have connecting to it. Heaven forbid, if you ever had credentials compromised, SSH multi-factor authentication is a great way to help mitigate that threat, because now there's two things that the attacker would have to compromise. And one of them is probably, the administrator's cell phone or other time-based token device, which is going to make it a lot more difficult for them. Application allow listing is just essentially us being able to say, hey, if there's an application that was not on this system at the time the agent was installed, then we're just not going to allow it to run. Lockdown rules, we could spend a lot of time talking about them, and that's the predominant way that we would probably be blocking a lot of the remote access Trojan attacks that I demonstrated for you today. Basically what these are is us saying, hey, we have a very specific set of behaviors that in this particular environment, we want to disallow. Maybe that's things like modifying the scratch directory on ESXi, or modifying the home directory, or maybe it's spawning netcat as the child process of a shell. There's lots of different things that we can do with lockdown rules that can make ESXi environments a lot more secure, especially in the face of things like ransomware and rats. And then our last level, the last line of defense that ZeroLock provides is AI behavioral detection, which is really just looking for the behaviors of well-known attacks, things like ransomware, cryptojacking, tampering, data theft, these sorts of things. We do have a model that monitors behavior on the endpoint, so on the ESXi host, and looks for processes that we've never seen before. We don't require a signature for this. There's no hashing involved, nothing like that. It can be a brand new piece of ransomware, and we still stop it because we're identifying the behavior that it's taking, which is the behavior that all ransomware takes, instead of looking at signatures. So just kind of a brief overview of ZeroLock and how it helps to mitigate some of the threats that we've talked about here today, that we've seen here today, including things like the living off the land ransomware. Yeah, this is just kind of a fun little thing here for the end. I'll leave this up for a few seconds. These QR codes lead to Shodan scans for different software suites, so vCenter, vSphere, and ESXi. Maybe take a look if this is something that you think that you've learned something here today, or you kind of had your eyes open to maybe how attackers operate in this space. Take a look and see if you have publicly accessible resources. Now, if you don't, that's good. Then that means you have one level of this hopefully taken care of. Hopefully none of these resources are publicly accessible in your environments. But if they are, maybe that's something to take action on. And even if they aren't, maybe it's also a good idea to start thinking about the other ways that you are protecting your systems, more than just making them not publicly accessible, because as we know, incidents happen. No system is perfectly secure, and it is a question of if or when, not if. And I'm happy to bring this back up later if anyone wants to get back at these QR codes. But that really has been my presentation. I appreciate you guys bearing with me today and working through understanding how rats attack hypervisors. I'm now happy to take questions, and I'll stick around here for a few more minutes in case there's any other chatter.
All right, Nathan. We do have a couple questions. The first question is, how did you gain access?
Sorry, I was on mute there for a second. So how did I gain access? The initial access that I gained the first time was via an exploit. So the SLB, that was part of the Nmap scan that I ran originally. And actually I can, here, let me pull my environment back up. Matt, can you let me know that you can at least see the sign-in screen again?
We can.
Okay, great. So how do we get access? The first way that we got access was via an exploit against the SLP service. That was how we got access. So one way or another, we had network visibility. Now, that was the part of the reason I showed you the Shodan scan. What we're saying in this particular scenario is that the attacker had network visibility to the ESXi host via some rhyme or reason. Take your pick of the way that they got in. Maybe they leveraged a router exploit. Maybe they compromised some other element within this particular organization's environment ahead of time, or maybe they just pulled up. They found a publicly accessible ESXi box, just like what we've seen here on Shodan. That's part of the reason I show that part up front. And then they sent this SLP exploit. That was this section up here. Was me running an OpenSLP exploit against the SLP service on a ESXi 6.7.0 host, because that particular version of ESXi is 100% vulnerable to a remote code execution exploit that I demonstrated here. I hope that kind of addresses the question. That was how we initially got access.
And then part two of that question is, I'm guessing you'll show us how we can monitor and be alerted to these exploits.
Yeah. So in this environment, I actually uninstalled ZeroLock. This is an unprotected environment. So I don't have that prepared today. If that is something that you are interested in seeing, I am happy to show it. We do have lockdown rules specifically written for the SLP exploit that I demonstrated today. So yes, that is a capability that we have. Yes, 100% it is something we protect against. But since I was trying to showcase a successful attack, this environment is not protected by ZeroLock. So I was just demonstrating how this might be done in another environment. yeah, we would see alerts on those exploits 100%. And again, we're happy to engage with you more on that if it's something that you want to see. I will give you a demo personally showing you that that is the case. I just don't have that prepared for today.
The next question is, in addition to hypervisor protection, can your platform also protect classic Linux systems in the same manner?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking it. We can. So originally our Zero Lock, our product, was written for Linux. We were a Linux first company. And then when we realized that most hypervisors really are under the hood, either Linux, and like, doing KVM based virtual machines, or a branch of Linux, which is honestly what the case is with ESXi, they were similar enough that a lot of our protections were fairly easy to port over. So now we do Linux and hypervisor security. But yes, 100%. If you have Linux servers that you want to secure in the same way, we have feature parity on Linux. So all of those same protections that we talked about just now for ESXi also apply to Linux servers as well. Yeah, good question though.
The Change Healthcare breach involved attackers leveraging stolen credentials to access a Citrix remote access service without MFA, allowing them to move laterally and deploy ransomware. Given that many remote access Trojans operate by establishing persistent access and enabling lateral movement within virtualized environments, how could Vali Cyber have mitigated this attack by preventing unauthorized execution and lateral movement at the hypervisor level?
Yeah, wow, that's a really good and detailed question. Thanks so much, Blaze. So yeah, great question. I would say that the first thing that we would have done probably is, were we on that Citrix server, right? Which is, another environment that we can protect. Then, well, one, MFA hopefully would have been implemented if Zero Lock was in place, right? Assuming that the system administrators were using all of its features and Zero Lock was installed, then we probably could have cut it off there, right? So if it was a credential compromise and they were just SSHing in, then use an MFA time-based token and the attacker can't get access that way. At the very least, they would have had to find another way in. And then moving laterally, yeah, there's without knowing the specifics of the particular thing, of the particular attack rather, it's hard to say specifically what we would have done. But what I will say is this: if they were doing anything like what I was doing, if they were using even custom tools, and we had things like the application allow listing protection in place that I talked about earlier, it would have prevented those from even executing. Now, if they were doing something more sophisticated, like living off the land, then we probably would have had to rely on things like lockdown rules, where we have an entire suite of lockdown rules written that protect against a lot of the common tactics, techniques, and procedures that we see offensive groups use. So, things like monitoring the temp directory for suspicious files, things like monitoring common network utilities like Netcat or Nmap, or take your pick of other, even SSH, right? Like take your pick of other common utilities that you see in Linux and hypervisor environments. We have a suite of lockdown rules that looks for malicious use of all of those tools to move laterally as well. So I'm going to look back at your question and see if I've addressed kind of most of it, but lateral movement with virtual, yeah. So the 100% though, I would say the unauthorized execution portion is what we talked about with application allow listing. That would be a huge part of it. Multi-factor authentication hopefully could have prevented initial access via the stolen credentials. And then lateral movement is really a question of how they laterally moved, right? But I think that we have a lot of tools that help with mitigating lateral movement. That is definitely a focus of ours. So if we get the specifics on that, I'm happy to talk about how we would have prevented specific tactics for lateral movement too. But yeah, we have a lot of protections for that kind of thing. Great question.
Can you protect the vCenter web management with MFA?
Currently, we don't, because it is a VMware product specifically, and we don't have access to their code base, and we can't change their software, and it's not something that we have an integrate. They don't. There's no integration that they provided with that yet. I'll stop sharing since we're mostly just talking now. So the short answer to that one is no. Sadly, it's not our product, and we can't enforce a multi-factor authentication on the web console.
Next question is, what does typical small deployment cost? Just want to see if this enterprise cost or SMB friendly.
Yeah,
3 host servers or 6 host servers?
3 hosts. Oh, okay, sure. So the pricing model that we use is typically per core. We try to do that to keep in line with how VMware does their pricing model for ESXi overall. So it's on a core per core basis. If you would like a specific quote on that, I'm happy to set you up with our sales team. Just respond with your either work through VMUG to let us give us some contact information, but typically I think that we stick. I don't know if we want to talk about pricing too in depth here. I think typically sticker is $50 a core, but I know that we come down significantly for that depending on the deal and who we're working with and all the factors involved. I think there's a lot of room for negotiation there.
And last question is, can you protect the vCenter server appliance with zero lock?
The vCenter server appliance. So are you talking about the yeah, I believe the short answer to your question, if I understand it correctly, is yes. The vCenter server itself, I think, is what you're talking about, which runs on top of ESXi. Yes, we can protect that. We can install a zero lock agent within the vCenter server. Yeah, good question though. All right, what else? I'll definitely be able to stick around for a few more minutes if there are other ones. Would turning on lockdown mode to normal for the host have prevented the attack? Lockdown mode to normal for the so yeah, the lockdown mode for ESXi I think is what you're talking about. That's a good question. I haven't actually attempted. I think that it might. Sorry, I just saw the second question pop up. I was reading it really quick. I haven't tested this particular attack against lockdown mode, but in general, yeah, if you are running ESXi in lockdown mode, which you may be, right? Like that may be something that you're doing, then this particular rat would be a lot harder to actually run. Yeah, for sure. But I haven't tested it specifically. So I can get back to you on that though. I can let you know. I can put one of these environments in lockdown mode and try and run it and see which parts of my attack would have been thwarted by that. And how to access the reply of this demo if it's recorded. I don't know if I understand the question, but I'm sure that we can get you here. I am actually going to go ahead and share just that last slide so that if you guys have questions, you can have this contact information for us specifically. Give me just a second. Okay. Matt, can you see my screen again?
Not yet, no.
Oh, maybe it didn't go through all the way. Hang on. Screen 2, share. Okay.
Now we can see it.
Great. Okay. Yeah. So if there is anything that you'd like to go over with us, any more questions about this, if you'd like to see a demo covering topics that you consider most important to your environment, that's something that I know that we would be happy to engage with anyone that's here in the webinar today on. And I'm happy to take on some of those conversations personally too. They're happy to give specific technical demos on specific capabilities as long as it's something that we can show. Happy to do it. Right. Any other questions? There was a good round of questions though. Thank you all for some of them a little bit pressing too. Those were good ones.
We just had another question come in. Lockdown mode strict may be prevented the attack due to the access list reducing it, even the root account access. I'm and ensure that the nature of secure boot with TMP 2.0 would be good research item.
Yeah, Demetrius, totally agree. I think you're right. I think that if you were running in lockdown mode, some of my particular attack may have been mitigated. I think that's fair to say. Yeah, and I wouldn't make any intimation to the contrary on that. It could be a really good research item. And actually, I think you prompted me to want to do a little bit more investigation about how much I could get away with this attack vector if it were in lockdown mode. So I think you've given me a little bit of homework here. This is something good for me, I think, to go back and do a little bit more research on, because that's a good question and it's a very fair question. So yeah, I'll have to look into it and see how much lockdown mode plays havoc with my Python rat. To be clear, this is something that I will also kind of like say here too. I tried to kind of get to it in the presentation, but I was moving pretty quick. So many of these things, right? This is not the only way to do a remote access Trojan. Some of them are pure binaries, right? Like it's not a Python script, which is like an interpreted thing, right? Like that's not a binary in and of itself. Some of them don't use a bash script like I used. I used two different scripts essentially, as well as an addition to the cron tab for the root user on ESXi to maintain persistence. And that's one method. There are other ways to do it, and some of them are trickier. Some of them are more temperamental. Some of them are more persistent than what I did. But this is just kind of for demo purposes. There's a lot of stand-ins, a lot of different ways to accomplish similar things. But I think that this is a pretty good kind of comparative analysis of how different attacks look. If you look at some of the previous things we've done in webinars like this versus this particular, rat, I think that we're covering a good swath of different attacks that we see leveraged against hypervisors. But yeah, given a particular attack, there are definitely some protections that would work, some protections that wouldn't. And lockdown mode is a good start for a lot of environments. All right. I am not seeing any other questions. Thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate being able to, you all being here, listening. I do think that this is a really important capability. I think it's an important topic, remote access Trojans in general, and understanding how hypervisors are increasingly under attack, especially in the last few years. We've really seen that really tick up a couple of levels because attackers are starting to understand how valuable they are. And if you can't tell, we really care about this. I think it's an important place to be focusing when it comes to cybersecurity. So if you have any other questions, anything else you want to chat about with this, anything else that you want to see from our end, then we're happy to share it with you. So please reach out. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nathan, for this great presentation. To find out more about the VMUG Webcast program, visit vmug.com and check out the webcast page. Please make sure to complete the short online evaluation that will pop up as you exit the webcast and let us know how today's session went. And from all of us here at VMUG, thank you and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.